Rain pressed against the tall glass windows of Empire Court, a towering five-star hotel nestled in the heart of New York City, its marble floors reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers, while an air of quiet luxury wrapped around every corner like a well-kept secret. And beyond the velvet-covered walls and golden elevators, the staff moved quickly and quietly, their eyes alert but never obvious, their movements sharp but never rushed. Among them, Elena Rivera stepped out of the staff locker room, her steps hesitant, her shoulders tight, her black pumps biting into her heels with every stride. And though she had only been working here for less than a week, her body already knew the weight of long hours and silent expectations. At 24, Elena looked older than her age, not from years but from the kind of exhaustion that builds over time, layer by layer, the kind that settles behind the eyes and never truly leaves. And though her uniform was clean and pressed, it clung to her like a reminder that she didn't belong in a place like this. Not really. Not among the silent fountains and silk drapes, and guests who didn't bother looking at her twice. She had taken the job because it paid more than any other she'd found, and with her younger sister's medical bills piling up again, she couldn't afford to be picky. She had promised herself she'd make it work, even if every day felt like walking a tightrope. That evening, as she finished cleaning her 11th room, her manager Brenda approached, clipboard in hand, eyes unreadable, and without looking up, she said bluntly, "Penthouse 43B, go clean it. Guest arrives tomorrow morning, make sure it's perfect." Elena blinked, surprised, knowing the penthouse suites were normally handled by the senior staff, but before she could protest, Brenda cut her off with a raised brow and an impatient sigh, and Elena, too tired to argue, simply nodded, took the key card, and pushed her cleaning cart toward the private elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent, the kind of silence that deepened every doubt in her mind, and as the elevator doors slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in golden light and lined with navy carpeting, Elena stepped out slowly, her breath caught somewhere between awe and anxiety. She slid the card into the lock, heard the soft click, and stepped inside. The suite was nothing like the rooms she had cleaned earlier that day. Everything here gleamed with opulence, from the chandelier dripping with crystal to the panoramic windows showcasing the twinkling skyline below. The bed looked like it belonged in a palace, the kind of place where people whispered instead of speaking and drank wine instead of water. She moved carefully, replacing towels, dusting furniture, aligning every item with precision. But her muscles ached, her vision blurred, and her chest burned with a heat she couldn't ignore. The early signs of a fever creeping in unnoticed during the day had now arrived in full. Her shirt was damp with sweat, her undergarments soaked, and the collar of her uniform clung to her neck like a wet rag, so she stepped into the bathroom, slipped out of her shirt and underclothes, and rinsed them under warm water, hoping to wash away the smell of chemicals and exhaustion. She found a thick hotel robe, clean and soft, and slipped into it, intending only to rest for a moment while her clothes dried, and as she sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress beneath her felt like heaven, a dangerous comfort that lulled her to stretch out, her mind whispering just 1 minute, only one. Within seconds, her eyes closed, her body surrendered, and sleep claimed her. She didn't hear the elevator return, or the soft click of the door unlocking, didn't see the tall shadow entering the suite with slow, confident steps. Julian DeWitt, founder and CEO of Verity Tech, stepped into his penthouse with the calm precision of a man who had walked through hundreds of luxury suites and claimed each one with silent authority. He was 35, dressed in a dark suit that fit like it had been sewn onto him, his face clean-shaven, his expression unreadable, his movements smooth and exact, the kind of man whose presence spoke before he did. He dropped his phone onto the desk, slipped off his shoes, and walked toward the window, pausing mid-step. Something was wrong. The air felt different, scented not just with lavender and wood polish, but something warmer, something human, and then his eyes shifted to the bed. There was someone there. A woman. She lay beneath the duvet, one leg exposed, a bare arm curled beneath her head, her chest rising and falling in soft rhythm, and the robe she wore had slipped halfway off her shoulder, exposing the smooth skin of her collarbone. Julian's body froze, every inch of him alert. Who was she? A mistake? A trap? Someone sent to test his boundaries, or worse, to exploit them? He approached slowly, eyes narrowing, noting the damp towel on the bathroom rack, the clothes hanging awkwardly over a chair. Nothing about the scene screamed seduction, and yet the intimacy of it made his jaw tighten. Her face, flushed from sleep or fever, was soft, unguarded, the kind of face that didn't belong in a scheme. He spoke, low and clear. "Wake up." She didn't move. He said it again, louder, still no reaction. He stepped closer, leaned down, placed his fingers gently on her shoulder, and the moment his skin met hers, her eyes snapped open. Wide with confusion and then pure horror, she gasped, jerked upright, pulled the blanket around her body and backed away toward the headboard, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here. I thought the room was empty. My supervisor told me to clean it. I swear I didn't mean anything by it." Julian remained still, watching her, his face unreadable. "I was just tired. I didn't feel well. I only meant to sit down for a moment," she stammered, her hands clutching the blanket like armor. Silence stretched between them until Julian finally straightened his spine, adjusted his cuff, and spoke with cold precision. "Put your clothes back on, then leave." Elena blinked as if unsure she had heard correctly, then nodded, trembling, already fumbling with the edges of the robe. Julian didn't wait to see what she would do next. He turned away and walked to the far end of the room, staring out the window, his mind sharp, focused, already calculating what this incident meant, not just for her, but for him. Elena stepped out of the suite with trembling hands, her heart still pounding inside her chest as if it were trying to escape the consequences she knew were coming. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, and, though her legs were weak, her mind screamed for her to move faster, to disappear before anyone else saw her, before the man in the room changed his mind and called security. She did remember how she made it back to the staff area, didn't register the curious stares from other housekeepers as she passed. Her only thought was survival. Her only instinct was escape. Back in the locker room, she threw on her half-damp clothes without thinking, her hands shaking so hard she could barely button her shirt, and when she finally sat on the narrow bench in the corner, her vision blurred, her breath shallow, not from the fever now returning in waves, but from sheer panic. Minutes passed, maybe more, before the crackling voice of her supervisor, Brenda, barked through the staff intercom, sharp and clipped. "Elena Rivera, report to my office immediately." Her stomach dropped. As she stood, the walls tilted slightly, and the cold tile floor beneath her shoes felt suddenly unfamiliar, but there was no point delaying what was inevitable. Brenda's office was tucked in the back of the service corridor, a space filled with filing cabinets and the scent of stale coffee. When Elena walked in, Brenda was already waiting, arms crossed, face a mask of impatience and something darker, disappointment, or maybe disgust. Next to her stood a man in a sleek black suit, his expression stern, holding a tablet that he turned toward Brenda as he spoke quietly. Brenda's eyes flicked to Elena and narrowed. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused?" Elena tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. "He walked in on you, sleeping in his bed," Brenda continued, not waiting for an answer. "Naked, in the penthouse, with no authorization to be there. What exactly were you trying to achieve?" "Nothing," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought the room was unoccupied. I didn't feel well. I sat down for a moment and—" "Save it," Brenda snapped, then turned to the man beside her, who remained silent, watching Elena like she was an unsolved puzzle. "The guest has not made a formal complaint yet, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear," Brenda said, her voice lowering. "You've embarrassed this hotel, put our reputation at risk, and frankly, if he decides to escalate this, we're done protecting you." Elena's knees wobbled. She grabbed the edge of the desk for support, her mouth opening to explain, to defend herself. But no words came, only the ache behind her eyes and the bitter taste of fear. "Until further notice," Brenda said coldly. "You're suspended. Hand in your access badge and wait for HR to contact you." That was it. No hearing, no investigation, just a single mistake. One vulnerable moment, and the world came crashing down. Elena walked out of the office in a fog, her mind trying to process what had happened, but nothing made sense. She hadn't done anything wrong, not on purpose, not with intent. But it didn't matter. Intentions meant little when power, money, and perception were involved. That night, Elena sat alone in her tiny apartment, the lights off, the room quiet except for the hum of the broken refrigerator in the corner. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't touch her phone, just stared out the window at the city beyond. A city that felt suddenly too big, too loud, too cruel. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment she opened her eyes and saw him. The man in the suit, the one who said nothing and everything with a single look. He hadn't shouted, hadn't accused, but his presence alone had made her feel smaller than ever. Somewhere across the city, in a different world, Julian DeWitt stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the same suite, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the skyline reflected in his eyes as he played the moment over again. She hadn't looked like a seductress. She hadn't acted like someone sent to manipulate him. Her panic had been real, her confusion unfeigned, and the way her hands clutched the blanket, trembling, told him more than any explanation could. Still, the situation was unacceptable, especially for someone like him, someone always watched, always judged, always one step away from a headline. He had told her to leave, and she had obeyed, but now, as the hours passed, something unsettled remained in his chest. Curiosity, perhaps, or something close to guilt. He walked to the desk, picked up the suite's landline, and dialed the direct line to hotel management. A moment later, a familiar voice answered, formal and alert. "Yes, Mr. DeWitt? I want to know what action you've taken regarding the incident this afternoon," he said. "The housekeeper has been suspended, pending a formal review," the manager responded quickly. "We assure you, this will not reflect on your experience." Julian didn't reply immediately. His eyes lingered on the damp towel still draped across the rack in the bathroom. "Make sure she's not dismissed," he said at last, his tone even. "Not yet." A pause. "Sir, you heard me," Julian said quietly, then ended the call. He didn't know exactly why he had said it, didn't understand why he cared whether she lost her job or not, but something about her face, the raw fear and confusion, the vulnerability, had stayed with him longer than it should have. It wasn't pity. He didn't pity people. But maybe, just maybe, it was something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Recognition, because for all her silence, all her trembling, she had looked at him without calculation, without expectation, and that alone had made her unforgettable. 2 days passed like shadows, slow and heavy, and Elena remained at home, too afraid to leave, too ashamed to speak. Her apartment felt smaller with every hour, the silence thick with questions she couldn't answer and doubts that grew louder with each breath. She had been suspended with no promise of return, her wages cut off, her dignity bruised beyond repair, yet no one from the hotel had called, no letter arrived, no follow-up meeting scheduled. She knew the hotel operated like a machine, efficient and indifferent, and she was simply a loose bolt removed before it caused damage, but even so, the quiet felt cruel, like punishment without explanation. She tried to distract herself, made soup she didn't eat, wiped clean already spotless counters, stared at her phone as if it might ring and undo everything, and when the call finally came late one morning, she almost didn't answer, her hand hovering over the screen, heart racing. The voice on the line was calm, polite, and entirely unexpected. It was not Brenda, not human resources, but the hotel director himself. "Ms. Rivera, after careful internal review and by special request, we've decided to reinstate your position effective immediately," he said, the words smooth but flat, as if rehearsed. "You will return to your previous duties starting tomorrow. A new schedule will be provided at reception. Elena blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. I'm sorry, by special request? She asked, her voice hesitant. Yes, the man said without elaborating. Your access badge will be reactivated before your shift. We trust there will be no further incidents. Then the line went dead. She stood frozen, phone still in hand, heart pounding with disbelief and something else, confusion. Who had intervened? Why now? And more importantly, what would the other staff think when she returned? The next morning, Elena stepped through the rear staff entrance of Empire Court with her eyes lowered and her shoulders tight, her uniform pressed, her hair tied back, but her confidence barely stitched together. Whispers greeted her in the hallway, murmurs that paused when she walked by, heads turning just enough to catch a glance, but not enough to be held accountable. The staff room felt colder than she remembered, and though no one spoke directly, the shift in energy was clear. She had become a story. Brenda barely looked at her as she handed over the new schedule, simply muttered that she had been reassigned to assist exclusively on the penthouse level, and Elena paused, stunned. The penthouse. Again. Is this a punishment? She asked quietly. Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly, lips tight. It's an assignment, take it or leave it. Elena nodded, swallowing her pride because she had no other option. As she walked toward the service elevator, pushing her cart with both hands to keep them from shaking, her thoughts spiraled. She had no idea what she would find upstairs, no idea what to expect, only that something had changed behind the scenes and somehow she had been pulled back into the orbit of the man whose room she had never meant to enter. When the elevator doors opened, the top floor was as pristine and intimidating as ever. The hallway stretched in elegant silence, the lighting soft, the carpeting untouched, and for a moment she simply stood there, afraid to move. Then she took a slow breath, gripped the cart tighter, and walked forward. She cleaned quietly, methodically, her every movement precise, double-checking towels and restocking soaps as if the act of working correctly might erase the memory of that afternoon. And then, just as she finished folding the last towel in the hallway linen cabinet, she heard the soft chime of the elevator behind her. She turned before she could stop herself, and there he was. Julian DeWitt stepped out of the elevator, dressed in a navy suit without a tie, sleeves rolled casually to his elbows, his expression unreadable, as always, his eyes landing on her without hesitation. For one long second, neither of them spoke. "I see you're back," he said finally, voice low. Elena nodded, unsure if she should speak. "They called yesterday," she said carefully. He didn't answer right away, only tilted his head slightly, then walked past her toward his suite. When he reached the door, he paused, looked back. "You left the towel cabinet unlocked," he said, not unkindly. She flushed, hurried over to fix it, and he watched for a beat longer before entering his room and closing the door behind him. The next 3 days followed a strange rhythm. Julian made no direct requests, gave no indication that he had influenced her reinstatement, but small things began to happen. His suite called for extra towels, and Elena was the one sent. A special wine delivery arrived for his room, and she was asked to bring it upstairs. Each time she knocked, she expected another accident, another wave of tension, but each time he was calm, polite, even distant. He didn't question her or interrogate her, but something about his gaze lingered, as if watching for something unspoken. On the 4th day, the hotel reception rang through to the staff lounge with a special request. "Julia DeWitt is asking for one specific staff member," the voice said, Elena Rivera. The room turned to look at her. Brenda frowned. "He wants you to serve dinner to his suite tonight." Elena's throat tightened. "Why me?" "Ask him," Brenda said, eyes sharp. That evening, with trembling fingers and a tray balanced carefully in both hands, Elena stood outside the door of the penthouse once again. She knocked. The door opened immediately. Julian stepped aside without speaking, motioning for her to enter, and she moved past him, the scent of warm spices and wine filling the room. She set the tray down on the table, tried to retreat, but his voice stopped her. "Stay." She turned, unsure. "I'd rather not eat alone," he said simply, and for once there was no coldness in his tone, only quiet honesty. "I'm not sure that's appropriate," she said softly. He didn't push. "Then just sit. You don't have to talk." She hesitated, heart racing, but something in his voice, almost gentle, made her nod. She sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap, and as he poured wine into 2 glasses, his eyes never left hers. The candlelight flickered between them as the quiet stretched on. Elena kept her eyes down while Julian cut into his steak with measured precision, every movement controlled, every pause deliberate, and though neither of them spoke, the silence felt weighted. Like something heavy but not hostile, something still forming its shape. She didn't touch her wine. Her hands remained folded in her lap, tense and unmoving, while her thoughts rushed wildly beneath the surface, trying to understand what this was, what it meant to be sitting across from a man who could have destroyed her career, but instead had asked her to stay. Julian finally leaned back slightly, lifted his glass, and said without ceremony, "You're not like the others." She looked up, startled, and he clarified, "The ones who smile for tips, ask questions they don't care about, pretend they aren't listening when they clearly are. You don't do any of that. And I've been in enough hotels to notice the difference." She said nothing at first, then nodded once, her voice quiet, "I'm just trying to keep my job." He studied her a moment longer, then gave a bare nod as if that was the answer he had expected. They sat in silence again as the meal continued, interrupted only by the soft clink of cutlery and the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Elena couldn't bring herself to eat, not because the food wasn't good, but because her stomach was too tight, and every breath she took felt like walking a wire. When she finally stood to clear the dishes, he stopped her with a single word, "Sit." She paused, her hand still on the tray, unsure what to do. "You haven't eaten," he said, not as an order but almost like an observation, and she hesitated before lowering herself back into the chair. "I'm not used to being invited to dinner by my employer," she said cautiously. He let out the faintest trace of a smirk. "I don't usually ask housekeepers to sit at my table." That surprised a laugh from her, short and nervous, but it broke some invisible tension, and for a moment they were simply 2 people, not separated by title or class or the history of what had brought them together. Over the next week, this strange rhythm continued. Julian never asked for her directly, but always managed to have her assigned to his floor. His suite needed more towels, a certain blend of tea, a specific bottle of wine that conveniently arrived during her shift, and every time she brought something to his door, she found him waiting, calm and quiet, never pushing, but never retreating either. Sometimes he asked her to stay, sometimes he didn't, but always his gaze followed her with a kind of quiet intensity that made her breath catch. Elena began to feel the shift in herself, in the way her heart moved faster when his name appeared on the assignment board, in the way her hands shook just slightly when she reached for the penthouse tray. She told herself it was nerves, maybe gratitude, maybe confusion, but deep down she knew it was something else entirely, something dangerous. And yet she also began to notice the looks from others, the whispers that grew louder with each passing day. Sophia, one of the longer-serving maids, began to watch her with narrowed eyes and tight lips, her voice sharp with passive comments whenever Elena walked by. Remarks like, "Some of us earn our shifts the old-fashioned way," or "Must be nice having powerful friends upstairs." Elena tried to ignore it, but the tension followed her, building like static in the air. One afternoon, as she left the staff room with a tray in hand, Sophia stopped her in the hallway. "Going to the penthouse again?" she asked, her tone laced with fake innocence. "He must really like the way you arrange his pillows." Elena froze, then kept walking, refusing to take the bait, but the words lingered like smoke. That night, Julian requested herbal tea at an odd hour, and she was sent again. She knocked softly, entered when he called, and as she placed the tray on the table, She couldn't help herself. "Why do you keep asking for me?" she asked, her back still turned. He didn't answer right away. She turned around slowly, and he was watching her again, that quiet gaze that seemed to pull thoughts straight from her head. "Because you don't try to impress me," he said, then added, "and because I don't like liars." She sat down without thinking. "People are starting to talk," she said carefully. "It's becoming a problem." He tilted his head slightly. "For them or for you?" She hesitated. "Both." He was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "If you want me to stop, I will." She opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what she wanted, not really, not when every instinct said to run, but every part of her stayed rooted to the chair. "I don't know what this is," she said finally. "Neither do I," he admitted, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant they were both standing at the edge of something they couldn't define. The next day, the tension reached a boiling point. Elena arrived to find her locker open, her name badge missing, and a note tucked inside. A torn scrap of paper with one word scrawled in messy ink. "Slut." Her stomach dropped. She folded the note slowly, kept her face blank, and said nothing. That afternoon, when Julian's dinner tray came late, she wasn't assigned to deliver it. Another housekeeper went instead, but within 20 minutes the phone rang at reception and Elena was called upstairs. When she arrived, Julian stood near the window, his back to her. "Why didn't you come?" he asked. She looked down. "I wasn't on the list." He turned. "Then change the list." She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "Someone's trying to intimidate you." Her eyes widened. "How do you know?" He handed her a photo on his phone. Security footage from the hallway, grainy but clear enough. Sophia entering the locker area with something in her hand. Elena's breath caught. Julian was still watching her. "You can let them push you out," he said, "or you can stop running." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time saw not the billionaire in the suit, not the man who owned buildings, but the man who had made space for her at his table again and again without asking for anything in return. And something in her shifted. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, almost approving, then turned back to the window as if that ended the matter. But Elena knew it didn't. Nothing about this was over. The first time Ariana walked through the glass doors of Empire Court after 2 years away, her presence turned heads instantly, not because of her beauty, though that was undeniable, but because of the air she carried. Cool, confident, rehearsed, the kind of woman who wore power the way others wore perfume. Her heels clicked across the marble with precision, her designer coat falling neatly over her shoulders, and when the receptionist glanced up, she didn't need to introduce herself. Her face was already familiar, not just to the staff, but to the city itself, to tabloids, to the parties she used to host with Julian DeWitt at her side. She hadn't planned to return, not really, but when she heard whispers that Julian had been seen dining with a hotel maid, rumors too absurd to ignore, she boarded the next flight from London and landed with one purpose in mind: reset the narrative. Julian didn't know she was back, not yet, and she wanted it that way. She had never been the type to announce her moves too early. That afternoon, while Julian was still in a conference call on the 28th floor, Ariana made her way up, bypassing reception with a practiced smile, the kind that made people move without question. She stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the penthouse like she had never left, like her name was still written across the door. But as she reached for the handle, the door opened from the inside. Elena stood frozen in the threshold, tray in hand, eyes wide, her uniform neat but modest, her posture uncertain. Ariana took her in with one sweeping glance, from the practical flats to the simple hairpin behind her ear, then smiled slowly, not kindly. "Oh," she said, her voice smooth like silk over ice. "You must be the new help." Elena blinked, unsure whether to speak or step aside. But Ariana didn't wait for a reply. She brushed past her and into the suite, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, sharp and sweet. "Julian," she called out, as if nothing had changed, as if 2 years and one very public breakup didn't hang between them like a shadow. Julian stepped out of his bedroom, his shirt sleeves rolled, phone still in hand, eyebrows lifting slightly at the sight of her. "Ariana," he said, not surprised but not pleased either. "What are you doing here?" She smiled again, that same curated curve of lips that had once charmed magazine covers and dinner guests alike. "I heard things," she said, glancing back at Elena, who now stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to stay or flee. "Rumors, stories, you know how people talk." Julian didn't answer, his gaze shifting to Elena briefly, then back to Ariana. "You should go." Ariana tilted her head. "You used to invite me in." "That was then," he said simply. Elena set the tray down quietly, trying not to draw attention, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She didn't belong in this room, not with this woman standing like a reminder of another world, not with Julian caught between past and present. Ariana turned to her again, eyes narrowing slightly. "She's cute," she said casually. "A bit plain, but I suppose that's refreshing." Julian's voice was flat. "Enough." Ariana raised her hands in mock surrender. "Touchy?" Elena finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should leave." Julian shook his head. "Stay." Ariana raised an eyebrow. "Really, Julian?" He turned to her fully now, his tone colder than before. "You don't get to question me, not anymore." "So she's more than just a distraction," Ariana said, and for the first time her smile cracked slightly. "I didn't expect that." "You don't know her," he said quietly, "and you never knew me." Silence followed. Elena stood still, her heart pounding, her skin hot with embarrassment. Yet something about the way Julian had said it made her... Ariana looked between them, then laughed once, bitter and short. "Well," she said, brushing a hand through her perfect hair, "I won't stand in the way of your growth." She walked toward the door, her heels clicking again, and as she passed Elena, she paused just long enough to whisper, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Then she was gone. The suite was still. Julian exhaled, long and slow, then turned toward Elena, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," he said, "I do." She didn't reply, didn't know how to, not when the world she had fought so hard to understand had just shifted again, not when the past walked in wearing red lipstick and left her feeling small all over again. But Julian stepped closer, not urgently, just enough to close the distance between them. "Don't let her get in your head," he said softly. "I see you, not her, not anyone else." She looked up then, met his eyes fully, and for the first time didn't flinch, because beneath all the uncertainty, all the whispers and threats, she saw it too, the quiet truth in his gaze, the steady presence that had pulled her from fear and brought her here. And despite everything, she stayed. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the skyline, casting long orange shadows across the windows of Empire Court, and the city softened in hue. But Elena felt none of that beauty. Her thoughts were tangled, her breath shallow, and her chest still carried the weight of Ariana's words like small stones lodged in her ribs. She finished her duties with mechanical precision, her movements stiff but controlled, ignoring the curious glances from staff, the thinly veiled comments that passed like whispers from hallway to hallway. Her locker had been tampered with again. This time nothing stolen, but the message was clear. She was being watched. She tried to focus on the work, on folding towels perfectly, on lining toiletries edge to edge, on tasks that didn't leave space for fear or doubt. But everything about the day had unsettled her in ways she didn't know how to name. When she finished her last room, she handed in her cart at the supply station and was about to leave for the night when a bellman approached. "You're needed in the penthouse," he said quickly. "Mr. DeWitt requested you directly." Elena hesitated. For what? The boy shrugged. Dinner, I think. Something about needing assistance with private service. She looked down at her hands, noticed they were shaking. Thank you, she said softly, then walked toward the elevator. On the way up, she tried to steady herself, told herself this was just another moment, another interaction, nothing more than a repeat of all the previous quiet evenings she had spent in his presence, serving tea, answering light questions, maintaining boundaries, but in her heart she knew tonight felt different. When the elevator doors opened, Julian was waiting. He had changed into a dark shirt, sleeves rolled, again no tie, and his posture was relaxed but purposeful. He gave her a single nod, then stepped aside to let her in. Inside, the suite was warm with golden light, the dining table set for two, candles flickering gently in tall crystal holders, and the scent of roasted garlic and fresh thyme hung in the air. She froze. This isn't room service, she said quietly. No, he replied. It's dinner, with me, if you'll stay. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I want to talk, he said. Not as guest and staff. Just us. She didn't answer immediately, didn't move either, just stared at the table as if the sight alone might burn her. Then, without a word, she stepped further inside, let him pull out a chair for her, and lowered herself slowly into it. He poured 2 glasses of wine, handed one to her without expectation, and for a few minutes they ate in silence. Not out of discomfort, but out of something else, a fragile respect, an understanding that neither of them wanted to break what was finally still. After a while, Julian spoke. Ariana and I were over long before we ended things publicly. He said, What you saw today. It was a ghost. She came back, hoping I was still the same man who would forgive anything if it was wrapped in charm. Elena didn't look at him. I'm not asking for explanations. I know, he said. That's why I'm giving them. She met his eyes then, saw no apology in them, but something steadier. She didn't seem like the kind who gives up easily. She's not, he agreed, but I'm not the man she left. Not anymore. Then who are you now? Elena asked, surprising even herself with the boldness of the question. Julian didn't flinch. Still figuring that out. But I know who I don't want to be. He set down his glass, leaned slightly forward, elbows resting gently on the edge of the table. That's part of why I asked you here tonight. She looked at him, the quiet weight of his words settling over the space between them. I need someone I can trust, he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Not just in passing moments or small favors, I need someone who sees the whole picture. Someone real. I'm offering you a position as my personal assistant. Elena blinked. What? I'm expanding operations, launching new projects, and I need someone close who isn't trying to climb or flatter or impress. You're grounded, you pay attention. You don't pretend. I clean rooms, she said. I've never worked in an office. I'll teach you what you need to know, he replied. The rest you already have. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to wake from something. Why me? Because, he said slowly, you're not afraid to look at me and still speak the truth. That's rare. Elena looked down at her hands. This is a lot. I know. People will say things. They already are. They'll think. Let them think, he said simply. I want you beside me, not because I need decoration, but because I need clarity. She was quiet for a long time, the flicker of candlelight dancing across the surface of her wineglass. Finally, she looked up. What's the catch? Julian smiled faintly. There isn't one. But it won't be easy. You'll be exposed. You'll be watched. They'll assume things about us, about you. You have to be ready for that. She took a breath, then another, let the fear come and pass through her before speaking. I'm not sure I am. Then I'll wait, he said, and that was the first time she believed he meant it. After dinner, as she gathered her things to leave, he walked her to the door, not out of habit, but out of intention. Before she stepped into the hallway, she turned slightly, her eyes searching his. "You really think I can do this?" "I do," he said. "And when you do, the rest won't matter." She nodded slowly, then stepped into the elevator, the doors closing between them like a pause in a conversation not yet over. But the echo of his words stayed with her all the way down. It started with a photograph, grainy and poorly framed, taken from an angle just low enough to make it look secret, just distant enough to seem illicit. It showed Elena stepping out of Julian's suite late in the evening, her expression unreadable, her uniform slightly wrinkled, the light from the hallway casting her in silhouette. The photo landed in the inbox of Empire Court's general manager the next morning, accompanied by a short message that read only, "She's been sleeping her way up." The sender was anonymous, the tone venomous, and though the accusation was unproven, it was enough to stir panic among those who had already begun whispering behind closed doors. The image spread quickly through staff phones, passing from hand to hand like a spark catching dry leaves, and within hours it became the silent headline of every break-room conversation. Elena sensed the change before she saw the proof, sensed it in the way people avoided eye contact, in how the conversations fell quiet when she entered, in the way Sophia smirked at her openly now, as if daring her to deny the obvious. She found the printed photo taped to her locker later that afternoon, the corners curling slightly, a single red circle drawn around her figure in thick ink. Her breath caught, her stomach turned, but she peeled it off without saying a word and folded it tightly into her pocket. When she reported it to Brenda, the supervisor only raised an eyebrow and said coldly, "You bring attention, Rivera, then act surprised when it shows up at your door." Elena walked away without replying, not trusting herself to speak, not trusting the sudden heat in her chest that felt too close to breaking. That evening, she wasn't assigned to Julian's floor. No trade delivery, no linen service, nothing. She took it as a sign, one she didn't quite know how to interpret, and when her shift ended, she didn't wait by the elevator, didn't look up to the top floor, just clocked out and walked into the night. But what she didn't know was that Julian hadn't seen the photo yet, not until the following morning, when an emergency meeting was called in the executive office and the general manager placed the image in front of him without a word. Julian looked at it once, then looked up. "What's your point?" The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, there's growing concern that the perception of favoritism, or worse, could compromise the reputation of both the hotel and your name. Several staff members have come forward with complaints." "Complaints?" Julian repeated, his voice flat. "What exactly are they accusing her of?" The man hesitated. "That she has gained special access, unearned privileges, by leveraging a personal relationship with you?" Julian stared at him for a long moment, then stood slowly. "Who took this?" "It was sent anonymously." "Then it means nothing. With respect, Mr. DeWitt, it means everything, at least to those who believe it." Julian left the office without another word, his hands clenched, his thoughts colder than the wind outside. He called Elena's phone immediately, but it rang twice before going to voicemail. He tried again, still nothing. He sent a message asking to meet, but the text remained unread. That evening, when he returned to his suite, she wasn't there. No tea tray, no knock, nothing. The silence was different now, not peaceful, but hollow. 2 floors below, Elena stood in the staff lounge, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink, her name tag still pinned neatly to her chest, but everything else about her felt unmoored. She hadn't replied to Julian's messages because she didn't know what to say. She didn't want to explain something she hadn't done. Didn't want to defend herself against shadows, but more than that, she didn't want to see the doubt in his eyes. She had trusted him, not because of what he said, but because of how he looked at her, like she mattered, like she was more than what others saw. And now, even that felt fragile. That night, she made her choice. She wrote a letter, short and simple, folded it carefully, and left it at the reception desk with instructions to be delivered to Mr. DeWitt's suite. Then she walked out of Empire Court with her head held high, her bag over her shoulder, and her heart heavier than it had ever been. Julian found the letter later, waiting on the desk beside a single rose that had been part of that night's centerpiece. It read only, "I'm sorry, I can't be someone you have to defend. You deserve peace. Thank you for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself. No name, no goodbye. Just enough to break him quietly." He stood by the window for a long time afterward, watching the traffic below, the lights turning red and green and red again, and though the city moved without pause, his world had gone still. 3 weeks passed like smoke, weightless and hard to hold, and in that time the world didn't pause for anyone, not even for the man who had grown used to controlling it. Julian returned to work as usual, took meetings, signed contracts, approved mergers, but something beneath the surface had shifted. He smiled less, spoke less, his answers sharper, his tone clipped, and those closest to him noticed the change, though no one dared ask. The suite at Empire Court remained his, untouched and always waiting, but the warmth it once held was gone. The space felt too large, the silence too familiar, and every night he looked toward the door expecting a knock that never came. Elena had disappeared without a trace, no calls, no notes, no way to reach her. He had sent a driver to her last known address only to find the apartment empty, the mailbox stuffed with old flyers and the neighbors shrugging with vague sympathy. She had vanished completely, and for the first time in years, Julian felt powerless. Meanwhile, across the river in a quieter neighborhood, Elena spent her days behind the counter of a small cafe owned by a kind old couple who asked no questions and offered cash pay at the end of each shift. The work was simple, repetitive, and soothing in its own way. She brewed coffee, wiped counters, took orders, and at night she returned to a modest room above the bakery next door, where she shared a bathroom with 2 other tenants, and tried not to think about anything more than what she needed for tomorrow. But no matter how far she tried to run from her past, it followed her in the quiet moments. Sometimes she caught herself looking up whenever the cafe door chimed, expecting a tall figure in a dark coat, expecting eyes that saw through her walls, but he never came, and she told herself that was for the best. He belonged in boardrooms and towers of glass and steel, and she belonged where no one knew her name. One gray afternoon, with rain slipping down the windows in quiet streaks, Elena was wiping down tables when the door opened, and a gust of cold air swept inside. She turned without thinking, her hands still holding the damp cloth, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. Julian stood just inside the doorway, his coat damp at the shoulders, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't speak. He just looked at her like she was something he'd lost and didn't expect to find again. Elena's fingers tightened around the cloth, her heart racing, her voice caught somewhere between shock and fear. "How did you—" He stepped forward. "You used your real name on the job application. It wasn't hard." She swallowed. "You shouldn't be here." "Maybe not," he said, "but I am." The cafe was nearly empty, just one couple seated near the window and an elderly man reading the paper in the corner. No one paid them any attention. "What do you want?" she asked. "To talk," he said, "just talk." She hesitated, then nodded once, leading him to a quiet corner table away from the others. He sat across from her, hands folded, his expression unreadable. "You left," he said finally. "You didn't give me a chance to say anything." "There was nothing left to say," she replied, though even she didn't believe that entirely. They believed what they wanted to believe. "And I didn't want you to have to explain me." "I didn't care what they believed," he said, voice firmer now. "I cared that you didn't trust me enough to stay." That made her flinch. "I trusted you more than anyone. That's why I left, because I couldn't stand the thought of you standing in front of people who think they own the truth and having to shield me like I'm a mistake." "You were never a mistake," he said. "Not once." She looked down at the table, fingers curling around the edge. "Then why does it still feel like I don't belong in your world?" He was quiet for a moment, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out something small. A business card. black with gold trim. His name embossed in crisp lettering, and beneath it, a line written in pen. "When you're ready to stop running, come find me." He slid it across the table toward her. "I don't care where you come from, Elena," he said. "I care who you are when you look at me. I care that you're the only person who's ever told me the truth, even when it hurt. I care that the world doesn't scare you. It just hasn't seen you properly yet." She stared at the card, her heart thudding, her fingers still trembling. He stood slowly, adjusted his coat, and gave her one last look. "I'll wait," he said quietly, "but not forever." Then he turned and walked out into the rain, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and something softer hope. The business card sat on Elena's bedside table for nearly a week, untouched but never ignored. Its black surface seemed to shimmer each morning in the early light, as if it were asking her a question she still didn't know how to answer. She stared at it often, her fingers hovering just above, not ready to take it, not ready to throw it away. The words written in his handwriting remained burned into her mind, not because of their elegance but because of their sincerity, because for all the chaos that had erupted around them, he had never once treated her like a game. Each day at the cafe blurred into the next, the rhythm predictable and safe. Yet beneath that safety there was a constant hum of restlessness, a sense that she was shrinking herself to stay comfortable, and she didn't like what that said about her. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, she dressed in the one clean blouse she had left, pulled her hair into a tight knot, and stepped out into the city with the card clutched tightly in her hand. Her steps led her to a building she had only seen once in passing, tall and sharp against the sky, the words DeWitt Technologies etched in steel near the glass entrance. Inside, everything gleamed. The receptionist looked up as she approached, her eyes flicking to Elena's modest outfit, and she offered a polite, restrained smile. "May I help you?" Elena hesitated, then held up the card. "I'm here to see Mr. DeWitt. He told me to come." The woman glanced at the card, then back at Elena, clearly unconvinced. But before she could respond, a voice carried across the marble lobby. "Elena." She turned and saw Julian standing near the elevator, his coat slung over one arm, surprise flickering across his features before something softer replaced it. He crossed the floor without rushing, without hesitation, and when he reached her, he didn't smile, just looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't dared ask aloud. "You came," he said quietly. She nodded, her voice nearly lost. "I didn't want to run anymore." He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for too long. "Come upstairs." His office was spacious, but warm, sunlight pouring through the windows, the furniture sleek but not cold, and when she sat down across from him, she didn't feel like a visitor or a stranger, just someone who had finally stepped back into something unfinished. "Well, me?" she asked again, though she already knew the answer. "Because you never treated me like I was unreachable," he said. "And because every time you looked at me, I remembered who I wanted to be." The position he offered was no longer just a title, not just a favor or gesture. It was a role with purpose, challenge, and growth. He laid out the responsibilities clearly, the expectations high but not cruel, and for every task he offered to guide, to teach, not to control. She accepted, not because of what he offered, but because of how he believed in her ability to rise. Days turned into weeks, and Elena's world shifted again, this time on solid ground. She studied the business, sat in meetings, learned to speak the language of strategy and design, her questions sharp, her attention relentless. The staff, who once whispered behind her back, now watched with a different kind of interest, slowly recognizing that she was not passing through, but carving space for herself with quiet resilience. Julian never treated her as less, never paraded her presence, and yet everyone in the building understood she mattered to him in ways that went beyond position or title. They never spoke of love, not directly, not at first. It lived between them in the late nights reviewing reports, in the quiet cups of coffee on the balcony before sunrise, in the way their silences fit together like puzzle pieces. But it was there, growing steadily, built not from sudden declarations, but from trust rebuilt one layer at a time. One evening, as they stood at the edge of a rooftop party hosted for investors, Elena looked out over the city and said softly, "Sometimes I still feel like someone's going to tap me on the shoulder and tell me I don't belong here." Julian didn't laugh or dismiss it. He took her hand gently and said, "That's how you know you do, because people who don't belong never ask the question." She looked at him then, her heart full in a way that made words feel small. She didn't say thank you, didn't say I love you, but her hand tightened in his, and he understood. Later that night, as they returned to his suite at Empire Court, the one that had once been the scene of her deepest humiliation, she paused in the doorway. "It started here," she said, "and it could have ended here too." He turned to her, his voice quiet but certain. "It didn't, because you stayed true to who you are. And that's why we're still standing." In the silence that followed, she stepped into the room, not as a maid or an outsider or a shadow of someone else's narrative, but as herself, full and seen and no longer running. 6 months later, the woman who once pushed a cleaning cart through the quiet hallways of Empire Court now walked through the polished corridors of DeWitt Technologies with a tablet in one hand and quiet confidence in her steps. Elena had grown into her role not by becoming someone else, but by discovering just how much of herself had been buried beneath years of survival. She spoke clearly in meetings, took notes others forgot, noticed what others missed, and in every room she entered there was a subtle shift, a recognition that she belonged, not because Julian had placed her there, but because she had earned it. Julian watched her grow without ever trying to shape her into something else. He offered guidance when she asked, support when she stumbled, but more than anything, he gave her space to unfold. Their relationship remained private, not out of shame, but because it was theirs. A steady fire built from shared understanding rather than public display. On weekends, they spent mornings in bookstores or walking through markets without pretense. He no longer stayed in hotels every night, choosing instead to wake up beside her in the apartment they now shared on the quieter edge of the city, a place filled with books, soft lighting, and the scent of coffee she always brewed before he opened his laptop. One evening, as autumn crept in and the city changed color outside their window, Julian sat at the kitchen table, his sleeves rolled, his eyes on a document, but his thoughts elsewhere. Elena entered with 2 mugs, set one in front of him, and leaned against the counter. "You've been quiet all day," she said softly. He looked up, studied her for a moment, then closed the folder. "I've been thinking." She raised an eyebrow, half teasing, half curious. "Dangerous?" He smiled faintly, then stood, walked over and took her hands in his. "About how much has changed, about how close I came to letting something real slip through my fingers because of pride or fear or what people might say." Her expression softened. "You didn't." "No," he said, "but only because you walked back through that door." She shook her head. "Because you left it open." He reached into his pocket then, pulled out a small box, unassuming but unmistakable. Her breath caught, not because of surprise, but because of the quiet certainty in his eyes. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech, just opened the box and let the gesture speak. "Marry me," he said simply, not because the world expects it, not because we need it to prove anything, but because I don't want a life where you're not beside me. Her eyes filled, not with shock but with something deeper, the kind of emotion that comes when 2 people know exactly what they've found. She nodded, slow and sure. Yes. Months later, they stood together on the balcony of their new home, a modest house with wide windows and quiet views. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just theirs. The city shimmered in the distance, but around them was stillness, peace. Elena leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then, softly, he asked, "Do you ever regret it? That night in the hotel, she smiled, her voice warm. I regretted it for exactly 5 minutes. Then you told me to leave, and I realized I wasn't afraid of the mistake. I was afraid of what it might become. And now? He asked. Now I know, she said, turning to face him, that sometimes the worst timing leads you to the right place. He brushed a hand along her cheek, kissed her forehead gently, and held her close. The world they had built wasn't perfect, wasn't easy, but it was real, and in that reality they had found something worth keeping. Sometimes fate didn't knock politely. Sometimes it walked into a hotel room unannounced, dressed in exhaustion and wrapped in a borrowed robe. But when it did, it left behind more than surprise. It left behind the beginning of everything.